Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado,
welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
And I'm Kat.
And this week it was between, this is a marine mammal highlight episode. So this week it was between the bowhead whale and the spinner dolphin. And it was a rather convincing win this time. Sometimes it's pretty close, but this one was bowhead all the way. And secretly, I'm glad you guys picked the bowhead because
I think we were both excited to do the bowhead whale.
Yeah.
Honestly.
I learned some cool stuff.
Yeah.
These guys are crazy cool. So we're going to be going with one of the biggest whales, actually, and one that's really far away from pretty much everybody, except for those who've been really close to the Arctic. So we will go ahead and get started, and Kat will tell us about what they look like and their distribution.
Yeah. So like Cindy already said, these guys are basically found almost exclusively in Arctic and subarctic waters. So basically between about 60 degrees to 75 degrees north in terms of latitude. And pretty much you're talking about water that is experiencing that seasonal sea ice. That's a pretty big part of their ecosystem.
Very important.
So yes. So specifically areas that they inhabit include the Bering, the Chukchi, and the Beaufort Seas, Hudson Bay and Fox Basin, Baffin Bay, Davis Strait, and the Sea of Okhotsk, which I feel so bad that I still can't say that word. We've had so many species that exist there, and I'm like, I still can't say it. Yep. And waters in eastern Greenland and Spitsbergen through to eastern Siberia. So basically the Arctic Circle kind of is what we're talking about. In terms of appearance, these guys are, like Cindy said, they're one of the largest whales. So they grow up to about 60 feet in length. And they have a dark body with a distinctive white chin, which I thought was really cool. If you actually look at pictures, it's pretty neat. And they also have like some white kind of almost strap markings on their tail as well. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, they do not have a dorsal fin. So they are one of the few cetaceans to actually not really have a dorsal fin.
I think that's more common in places where there's lots of ice because you're going to be bumping along things and the dorsal fin would probably just get mangled.
Yep, that is very true. It's hopefully a very, very smart adaptation for them. Mm-hmm. And their bodies in general are very stocky and large. So they have like disproportionately large heads, firstly.
They're not streamlined like many of the other large baleen whales.
Oh, and this is where, again, if you think about moving around in sea ice, makes a lot of sense, right? Where they're having to get through the ice and like bang up against the ice to create air holes. So their skull can be over 16 and a half feet long, just the skull.
Just the skull. Good Lord.
Isn't that wild? I thought that was super cool.
Bigger than a lot of other cetaceans.
Yeah. I mean, so again, if you've ever seen pictures of these guys, that is really the most striking feature is they just have this very sturdy looking head. Mm-hmm. And it is having that thick skull that allows them to break through the sea ice. And apparently some native whalers have seen them break through ice as thick as 2 feet. And they've seen whales break through that. Yeah,
that's impressive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And actually, quick fun fact, which is relevant here, is that because they do accumulate scarring from breaking through sea ice, that can actually be used for identification.
Mm-hmm. They said that on the dorsal side of the animals, because that's a lot of them, they're using aerial stuff now. It's wounds from ice, from harpoons, rope lines, bullets, killer whales, propellers. But then that white pigmentation on their lower jaw and on the peduncle that you mentioned, they also use that for photo ID. So all of those things are able to be used.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then just lastly, with their appearance, obviously, as you'd imagine with an Arctic species, they do have a very thick blubber layer as well. So their blubber layer is about 17 to 19 inches thick, which is the thickest of any whale.
Yeah, I have one thing that said 1.6 feet thick. That's just...
Yeah, because I think, 12 inches is a foot, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's just, I mean, that's mind-boggling.
Yeah, imagine like this 60-foot animal, but like this much of it is
blubber.
That layer.
I mean, which makes sense if you're always in Arctic waters. It's going to be pretty cold all the time, but still impressive.
Very, very cool. So I will get into their status and their threats and stuff later, but let's talk about their behavior and diet.
Yes. So one of the coolest things about these guys is their baleen. Right. So these are baleen whales. They don't have teeth. They have those long plates of baleen that are made out of keratin, the same thing as our hair and our nails are. They have the longest baleen plates of all whales. Do you know how long they are? Did you see?
Yes. 4 feet.
There are 4 meters.
4 meters?
14 feet.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
That's like as high as a 2-story house.
I know.
Well, no, it's about as high as a 1-story house, right? 14 feet is about
well, because like a lot of people have like 8 to 10 foot ceilings.
Yeah.
So something like that, yeah.
Wild.
Yeah, and it's 12 inches in width. So it's like a foot wide.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. And they have like there's different ranges, but somewhere in like the low to mid 300 fringed overlapping plates.
Wow.
A lot.
That's a lot of div action that you can get going.
And their baleen, I believe I've seen one of the shorter ones. It was like I think close to like 6 feet tall. But they're very different than a lot of other baleen that you see. It's a lot of it's really thick and then really tiny hairs that come off versus like gray whales have more coarse, thicker baleen. So anyway, it's just mind-boggling how big these animals are. So how they feed, of course, is similar to other baleen whales, where they're basically filter feeding. They take in all the water and all the little tiny things, and then push out the water, and all the little stuff gets stuck. So the little stuff, meaning marine invertebrates, those that do not have backbones, including krill, euphosids, which I just like that word, and copepods. These are all basically small to moderately sized crustaceans. Now, I think small and moderate size is all relative. What does that actually mean? But they're pretty pretty small. They're planktonic, right? And so I'll repeat this every time we talk about a large whale, but the fact that these animals are so big and they feed on some of the smallest creatures on the planet, like it just doesn't. If you were to like design something, you wouldn't think that would be the best design.
And yet it's work, right?
Right. That works for a lot of them. So they will also ingest other invertebrates and small fish, and this is most likely mainly because they're not being specific. They're not like, I'm going to target that krill right there. They're like, look, there's a big swarm of them, and they take all of it, and whatever else is there happens to go down as well. So it's not that they can't eat them; it's just they go for these specific ones, species. But they need to eat about 2 tons of food a day.
I was so curious to see like how much food they had to consume.
Yeah, and they 100 metric tons, over 220,000 pounds per year. So again, like these guys are huge, and there's many of them. I am always just kind of mind boggled by how nature can support itself. It doesn't seem like there's enough to go around, but there is, as long as we don't mess with it too much. But that's a lot of really small things, right? How think about how much that has. It's not like, oh, there's like 20 fish that end up weighing that much. This is these tiny little things that weigh almost nothing.
Oh, yeah.
So it's pretty crazy. But they said they may also be able to feed on other fish species and on some bottom-dwelling crustaceans, which is interesting because, as far as I knew, the gray whales are really the only ones that were bottom feeders. But mainly they skim at the surface, so they come up and they'll open their mouth at the surface rather than in the water column and just kind of like mosey along as they do. But they can also feed in the middle of the water column and along the seabed. So they're kind of
pretty generalist then.
Yeah, they're more a generalist kind of, at least in the way that they feed on the things that they want to. Which is good. I mean, if you're a specific feeder, it's going to be a problem if your food goes away, right? Yeah. Any kind of issues.
We've talked about.
Yeah, exactly. So these guys these are, as Kat was talking about, with their with how thick their blubber is and their size and their heads and all that, they are the most adapted of the large whales to live in icy water, and probably really the only ones that live there year round. Most the larger baleen whales are transiting between warmer areas and colder areas throughout the year. We don't know a whole lot about their kind of social structure. They do see groups of usually 3 or less. Again, similar to many baleen whales, they're not really super social all the time unless they're aggregating for abundant food or during migrations they may get together, and also possibly for reproduction. But usually pretty small groups. They are really vocal, and I'll talk more about this in I'll talk more about it in the new research. But they have a large variety of calls, and the echoes of some of the calls are used to help find food and navigate ice as they migrate. So again, these guys don't have echolocation like the toothed whales and dolphins and porpoises do, but they can still use those sounds to help them navigate.
Right. It's almost like, it's like more like using a sonar sound pulse rather than, so I mean, obviously with echolocation clicks, we're talking about like just a pulsed sound where you can still use it by putting out a tonal sound, and still reflection back to gauge where you are and using that like a sonar.
Yeah. So I mean, something if you were like, going, ooh, and have an echo come back, you can still use that information. It's not exactly the same, but you can use it in a similar way.
Yeah.
And they don't know a lot about their listening ability and their vocalizations because they're kind of hard to study because they're in such cold water. But based on other closely related whale anatomy and vocalization, they think that bowheads hear best at low frequency. And that's pretty common for the larger whales. Mm-hmm. I did have in there that they break ice up to 3 feet thick, so 2 or 3 feet, like you were saying. It's pretty impressive and also necessary if you're living in the Arctic. You don't want to get stuck. They can stay underwater for over an hour at a time, so that's pretty good, which makes sense. Again, adaptation. If you get stuck under ice, you're going to want to be able to hold your breath for a while before you can get out. Yeah. But also thinking about that, if they're holding their breath and not just like moseying around, like they're actually actively trying to push through ice, like that's impressive because you're going to start losing your energy and your oxygen reserves the more energy you're releasing.
Right.
So these guys are mainly coastal and mainly shallow water, which is also interesting for larger baleen whales and for how big they are in the first place. But I have a couple of different specific populations where they did some seasonal information of like where they do. So these are maybe specifically for these populations, but maybe a general thing too of how they use the sea ice that you were saying was again so important. So in Eastern Canada, West Greenland, they are able to moderate the use of large-scale fluctuations in seasonal sea ice. So during high ice coverage, they have thick ice and large flow. They go to areas of high ice coverage, thick ice, and large flow size areas in the summer. And this is presumably to reduce risk of killer whale predation, which I'll also talk about in the new research section, and provide in retreating opportunities. So they go where they can hide in the ice in the summer where it's not completely frozen over. But then in the winter, they go to areas with low ice coverage, thin ice, and small flow areas to maximize the that are close to the maximum ice extent where the solid stuff comes out. And this is presumably to reduce risk of ice entrapment while remaining within the ice, right? So again, it's really winter. You don't want to go to the thickest part of the ice, which is going to be really thick and really hard to get out of. And then in Baffin Bay, West Greenland, which actually might be the same area, yeah. They go to high latitudes during the spring and summer, right? So when it's warmer, and then they likely in response to the sea ice retreat and increasing sea surface temperatures. So it gets a little bit warmer and they move up. And then when it gets colder, they come farther down in response to that decrease in the temperature. So again, that's following that ice. So they don't get stuck in the ice, but they're still close to it. But they have a really narrow range of temperatures that they like to stay in, and it's 0.5 to 2 degrees. So this isn't like a large change in sea surface temperature that they're moving into and out of. It's very small, which I think is important because a lot of the biologically important and relevant ranges of things are really narrow. Like same thing with coral, right? So it's like oh, it only went up, half a degree. Well, that half a degree may be completely out of their range that they can survive. So these small changes can have large impacts when the range that you are able to fit in is smaller. So then that's pretty much all right for behavior. They basically know kind of when they go in and out of with sea ice and stuff, and what they're eating. Reproduction, there's some fun facts here. So they become sexually mature at about 25 years, but it's more known based on how big they are. So between 35 to 45 feet. And that's pretty common for larger whales like this, where we don't have as much information. They'll use it from strandings or subsistence caught by Native Americans or caught by commercial fisheries back in the day. They would look at it by size. You could tell, okay, we don't know how old these animals are, but I know what size they are, and that's when they're sexually mature. So between 35 to 45 feet, males at 38 feet, physically mature at 50 feet. So, they're sexually mature earlier than they are physically mature. And females are slightly larger than males at both physical and sexual maturity. So, which I think would make some sense too, of just how much they have to stay warm anyway, being up there, but then they're one taking care of calves. They're going to have to be bigger in order to do that. Mating behavior has been seen year round, but as with many cetaceans, they may try it year round, but they have peaks in when they have babies. So most conceptions are thought to occur during the late winter or earlier spring, and the gestation is 13 to 14 months. And this is estimated. We don't actually really know. Calves are born then the next year, early April to early June, depending on conception. And they're born with really thick blubber because they're born into cold waters, right? So again, all the other baleen whales don't do that. They're like, let's go to the warm Mexico. Yeah, like I'm not going to do that. We're going to go to the warm place, then build up our blubber, and then go back north. These guys are like, we're just going to stay here the whole time. So very thick blubber, and they grow more quickly their first year of life than in any other time in their lives, which again, makes sense. They are weaned between 6 to 12 months, so they're only there with their mom, under a year, which is again is also common for baleen whales. And when they're born, they're anywhere between 11 to 18 feet long and 2,000 pounds. So they're like a ton when they're born. It's it's just hard to comprehend. Interesting. Yeah, very large baby. So girls, ladies, if you had, like a 10 or 12 pound baby, just it's nothing compared to the bowhead whale. And they calve once every 3 to 4 years, but I've seen some rates as up to 7 years. So relatively.
Environment too. Probably depends on the environment too, and like what food sources are available and whatnot.
Exactly. But it's interesting because a lot of times the calving interval has to do with how long the calf stays with the mother. So a lot of dolphin species, it's every 3 to 4 years because the baby stays with the mom for 2 to 3 years before then she gets pregnant again. But in this case, the baby's only staying for a year. So it's interesting.
Well, it's weaned after a year. That doesn't necessarily mean that the calf is no longer with the mother. It just means it's no longer drinking milk from the mother.
True. But I mean, that's mainly what, I mean, even in dolphin species, the calves will still nurse past 1 year. And so they still have that part of it, even though it's not as much. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Maybe there's another social context to that of learning and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just costly, I guess, too. Like if you're imparting that much to go into their blubber stores and fat stores, and then you're feeding them for a year and they're growing the most rapidly. I mean,
that's
just
true.
the on the mother's part would probably take a while to recoup that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably why. It's like, all right, I gave you all I had. Now I need 2 years or more to recover. Very true. And I just wanted to know, I have one fun fact that has to do with how big they are. They are not the largest, but they are one of the heaviest. So there are some larger, well, obviously blue whale's larger, but they're really fat, chunky, for whatever. Yeah, for lack of a better word.
They're beefy.
They're beefy. Yes, they're beefy. So that's what I have for our behavior, diet, and behavior. And I'm really excited about some of the new research that and more recent research. There's a lot of cool stuff that we're going to talk about. But after this next break, Kat will tell us about issues that they're having, and then we'll talk about the new research after that. So we will be right back. And we're back. So Kat, make us depressed before I
at this part, like, I mean, we're not depressing you, we're just informing you of the challenges that these guys are facing, so we're all better.
That's a much better way of putting it.
So we'll talk a little bit about their current status. So they are currently listed as endangered in the US under the Endangered Species Conservation Act, and they're listed as depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We'll get into why in just a second. But again, as we've mentioned with several other ice related species, getting really good population estimates is extremely difficult. So especially when you're talking about a species that's living where there is basically sea ice most of the year, spotting these guys, number one, is going to be really hard. And then getting appropriate equipment to go up there and actually do aerial surveys, which is typically how they're doing this, is also really challenging just at those cold temperatures. So all that being said, we don't have good overall population numbers. Estimates I saw were between about 10 to 15,000. I would say probably on the side of the 15,000, given that there was a few different stocks that I looked at that were closer to that 10,000 range. So it's probably more likely that we're around about 15,000, but that's not across the whole of their range. So as we'll get into in just a second, there are, well, I guess right now, there are multiple different stocks of bowhead whales that are recognized. So when we're talking about these management stocks, these are different, basically subpopulations that are distinguished based on either genetic differences or the fact that they don't intermingle geographically. And so I saw actually that a couple of different sources said that there were 4 recognized stocks, and then there was a couple different sources that said there were 5. So I think it depends how you're splitting them. Yeah. Apparently there are 4 different stocks recognized by the International Whaling Commission. So we have small stocks of just a few hundred animals in the Sea of Okhotsk and off the waters of Spitsbergen. The bowheads from Western Greenland and Eastern Canada. So I think this is where you're getting either the 4 or the 5, because some sources said that should be considered one stock, and there's more than 1,000 individuals. Some said that they should be split into 2 different stocks. And then the only US stock is the Western Arctic stock, which is also known as the Bering Chukchi Beaufort Sea stock.
Yes. The little seas just kind of mingle together. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that even though there's a relatively small range for these guys, they are kind of in these pockets. These populations are in pockets. And that can make it challenging for obviously conservation and management, because you're not dealing with a full dispersal of these animals over everywhere. You're talking about some stocks that are doing really well, some stocks that are not doing so well.
It's very similar to the residents here, the resident killer whales, right? So in the same area, relatively small area, northern residents are doing great and the southern residents are very endangered. So it makes it difficult.
Yeah. So this is where, again, it really, getting down to that fine scale is really more useful and more relevant for especially this type of situation. So let's talk a little bit about why the population numbers are where they are. So historic whaling is a huge deal for these guys. So bowhead whales were one of the #1 targeted whales during commercial whaling. Worldwide population estimates prior to whaling efforts were estimated at a minimum of about 50,000 animals. And bear in mind, that's a minimum because we're talking high Arctic, like people couldn't get up there. So that's just based on what we knew of. After commercial whaling, the population decreased to just 3,000 animals by the 1920s.
I saw that number and I was like, what? That's
literally like less than, it's a tiny percentage of what we think their original population numbers were.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to do that do it
I'm
wrong.
gonna do that math right now.
Okay, good. Because
my
I was,
calculator. That's
I'm like,
6%. 6%.
and that's probably less than 6% because it's likely that there were more than 50,000 animals. We just couldn't find them all.
Right.
So that's really, I mean, this is what we're talking about in terms of a historical context for these guys.
And I think
while,
they said that the one of the reasons why they liked them is because they floated better than other whales. Yeah. So probably because they have
also, I mean,
1.6 feet of blubber.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so I mean, that was the main point of the whaling effort, was to get oil for lamps, for different machinery, and meat obviously as well, but predominantly they were hunting the fats and the oils at that point. So if you have a whale that has like 2 feet of blubber, that's a no-brainer.
Big bang for your buck.
Yeah, exactly. So in good news, some of the stocks are showing considerable recovery from this. So for example, the Western Arctic stock, they talked about quite a bit in the different sources that I found, where they seem to be actually doing very well and have recovered quite well. Populations such as the Okhotsk Sea population, however, is still estimated at just a few hundred individuals and does not seem to be recovering very well. So again, this is where you get into these very subpopulation specific contexts. And commercial whaling of bowheads is prohibited, but there are small subsistence whaling that still occurs with native peoples in the Arctic. And that is fairly well monitored by the IWC and things like that. That's typically just taking a few individuals every year. They're not taking like large numbers. But there is still some dedicated hunting of these animals that is occurring. So there's that. In terms of threats that these guys are facing, entanglement is actually also quite a big problem. Apparently about
so big.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I was kind of surprised with this just because they live in the Arctic. So in my head, there's not actually that much traffic up there still, but I mean, there is. And I forget that there are commercial fisheries that happen in the Arctic. So apparently about 12% of the Western Arctic stock, for example, have shown scars from fishery interactions. So that's a pretty large population. And typically this is with pot fishing gear. So this is if you're dropping pots, which have lines to the surface, they get tangled in the lines, as we've talked about before.
Yeah, with the North Atlantic right whales.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's generally an issue whenever there are lines in the water. This is potential chance for entanglement, and especially for these whales where they are limited and potentially where they can go because of sea ice, or they're utilizing open pathways as much as possible, which would be the same as the.
Yeah, and they're also in shallow waters a lot more, so they're going to be in those because you're not putting pots with buoy lines in really deep water. So
their ranges overlap with the fishermen. Yeah, right. For sure. Related to that as well, vessel strikes are another issue. So again, death or injury can result from these strikes. About 2% of animals that are caught for subsistence harvest show signs of vessel interactions and or scarring from vessel strike. So again, that's just the percentage of the animals that are being caught. So the percentage that have had vessel interactions is likely much higher than that.
Well, impressive they can survive it too. So because they survived it until they got harpooned, So.
Which is great. But as the sea ice decreases in the Arctic and we have more and more ships moving into these areas, obviously the likelihood of vessel strike just increases.
Yeah. And they're so big.
They're right
because they're so big.
Yeah, that is the tricky part with large animals, is that it just takes longer for them to get out of the way. And again, you're maneuvering in potentially not a lot of space if there's ice in your way, or if it's very shallow and you can only go a certain direction because it's too shallow that way, so it's not great. As you already alluded to, climate change is a huge one for these guys. Those changes in sea surface temperature, layers of sea ice that are actually present, all of that directly changes not only their behavior, but the behavior of their prey that they're foraging for. And that can reduce their longevity, just because if they can't get enough food or if the food moves, especially for these guys where they have to eat so much and just to sustain themselves, that's a huge problem.
And it also can change their predator behavior, and that I'll talk about that in research. Unless you're going to
I mean, I'm going to talk about it in the threats, but I'm sure we'll allude to more in the current meeting. Contaminants is another big one. So again, with having such a thick blubber layer, the contaminants, toxins that these animals intake are usually stored in the fat layers. That's true of all mammals. And as they metabolize those fat stores, that's when they basically dose themselves with whatever contaminants are present in the fat stores. So again, this kind of can layer on top of issues of climate change or decreased foraging success, because if they're then having to metabolize their fat stores and they've been storing toxins in there for quite some time, that's a problem.
And then passing it to babies.
Yeah, so the mothers offload. Usually the first calf that a mother has is highly, highly toxic. Yeah. And that's true, again, of most large mammals in the cetacean world.
So I was just thinking too, like it would be interesting to know whether, if we're talking about before that the length of the reproductive cycle is based on, you know, only nursing for a year, but then having to recover. If they don't nurse for that long because the baby dies, do they recover faster, or does it even take longer because of just other issues going on? Because a lot of times you'll see that the lower amount of food they can get and all that other stuff increases the length they have. So if you're also increasing the length between the babies and your babies are dying, you're in really bad shape.
Yeah, for sure. So this is where you can kind of see like these threats and problems kind of layer on top of one another. Ocean noise is a big one. Again, like you said, these are highly vocal species. So as with anything, you know, behavioral changes occur, decreased foraging efficiency, problem finding their other animals in the water column, and also avoiding certain areas are pretty big side effects. And I did find one study that was talking about seismic exploration, and that the bowheads basically vacated the water for about 12 miles around the seismic exploration site. And again, I don't think they necessarily know if they came back once it was done, but just the fact that they avoided it for that like wide distance. Yeah. I mean, 12 miles is a long distance.
It's a wide berth.
Yeah. So I mean, that's where if they're actively avoiding sources of sound, obviously, again, as the Arctic opens up, as there's reduced sea ice and there's more vessels up there, ocean noise is just going to become more and more of a problem, because more drilling and more exploration up there is going to be occurring.
So I'm gonna put in one of my research ones here because it makes the most sense to do. Since you're talking about seismic air gun stuff or seismic things. In Alaska and Beaufort, they showed that call rates change. So the bowhead calls actually increase when the initial seismic guns go off. Then it kind of plateaus to a kind of normal level, and then it decreases. So the calling rates increased as soon as they were detected. The air gun pulses were detectable. And then they leveled off at like a lower threshold, like at 94 decibels per, I forget what the other half of the unit is, but about 94 decibels received. And then once the sound exceeded 127, call rates began to decrease. And then once it got above 160, they just stopped calling altogether. So
yeah, so that's a pretty common trend that they found with multiple marine mammal species in acoustic studies, where basically, and it makes total sense, right? If you're in a loud restaurant, you're going to talk louder for a certain amount of time. If the noise in the restaurant continues to get louder, you're probably going to start talking less. And eventually you're just not going to talk to the person across from you because you're going to be shouting.
Yeah.
And you don't try. So it's a very, very common trend that they've shown with a lot of these species in response to anthropogenic noise effects. And it's not good. I mean, again, it's that all is taking a lot of energy for these animals to produce these sounds too, which we tend to forget about. So yeah, that's not.
And not being able to use it to find food or others or navigate sea ice. Like you're just running sea ice because you can't see it.
Yeah, for sure. And then finally, just talking a little bit about predation, so we can go into that study as well after this. So mammal-eating killer whales are obviously the main predators of bowhead whales, and they seem to be a pretty solid prey source for the killer whales. So again, animals that have been subsistence hunted have shown multiple scarring and evidence of prior attacks by orcas. And the rates of scarring associated with attacks seem to be increasing. So again, we don't necessarily know if this is because we are better at identifying what is an orca scar versus another type of scar, whether they do seem to have been showing increased rates of marine mammal eating killer whales in the area. So it seems like the animals are just around more. But what was your new research on that?
Well, so in 2020, like they really thought that previously it was a very low risk based on the sea ice and the killer whales not really being up in that area. But in 2020, they did imagery and sighting data of carcasses from 2009 to 2018 and found that killer whale predation was the primary cause of death for them in the US Pacific Arctic. So correlating with, kind of climate change stuff where the sea ice is decreasing, the killer whales can come up further and they can't hide as well. And so it's, it's changed in what that risk is for these animals. So the risk of, okay, I need to go forage, but there's killer whales here, do you take that risk or do you forage less and not get predated upon, but then not be able to do reproduction as well because you're not foraging as efficiently. And the other thing, which is really interesting, is talking about with the seismic activity that they gave a wide berth to that area. So predators can kill the animals directly, but they can also create what's called a landscape of fear. So basically, if you know the animals are there, you're not going to go there, right? If you know that there's a bunch of wolves in that one spot, you're not going to go anywhere near that bunch of wolves, terrestrially. So they found from tracked animals in the Canadian Arctic that killer whales make this landscape of fear that drives selection for the sea ice, the dense sea ice and shorelines by the bowhead. So they're staying closer to shore in thicker packed ice to stay away from where they know that killer whales are based on listening or however they know. And so this was you kind of alluded to those before, talking about the non-consumptive effects of these issues, right? So it's not just that they're getting eaten or taken by or killed by the predators, it's that now they are restricted their habitat space. Now maybe they're more in where they're going to get entangled, maybe they're more where there's more boats. So these and then they don't get as much food, so these things layer upon, and it's not just direct killing, it's these indirect effects that are like death by 1,000 paper cuts, where they just have it together.
Interesting. No, that makes sense.
So I know it was interesting. It's interesting that the 2020 study was really like, oh, this is a serious thing, where they really didn't think that killer whales did that much damage to these guys. So very, very interesting. And that tracking animals study in 2020 said that there was pronounced predator-mediated shifts in prey habitat use. So, the predators are forcing the bowheads to change their habitat use and behavior over a much larger spatiotemporal scale than previously documented in any marine or terrestrial ecosystem. So much wider, like how big they're moving and the time frame that they're staying away from places is much larger than anything else that they documented, which is
interesting, because that's similar to what that seismic exploration study was showing, that they had a very, very strong avoidance response.
And I mean, does it have to do with how big they are? They just need to make bigger movements, or like
also, again, like these are long-lived species, so again, some of these animals likely experienced heavy whaling effort too when that was still going on. So again, like, is this some sort of remembered response that they just have a much stronger population response that has been passed down because they were targeted for so long? That might play into it too.
Right. Well, and so since you just said longevity, I know that may be a fun fact for later, but I think it fits in well here, is that they're one of the longest living species that we know of. They've found estimates for these guys from stone and ivory weapon fragments that have been embedded in the blubber. Ouch. But I guess hopefully they don't feel it anymore. But the age of the production was unknown for those. They gave a roundabout time frame. They did chemical analyses of eye lenses. I didn't realize that you could do ages from eye lenses. Don't ask me how. That was pretty cool. And then they also, another study used counts of ovarian corpora, so as your eggs develop. And all of those different types of studies showed that they can be over 100 years, oftentimes up to 150 years old. There was another specific one that found bomb lance fragments that were recovered in 2007, and these were the only things that were actually datable of all these other ones that they've estimated from. And it was likely in production between 1879 to 1885. So so these guys are at least 150 years. I've seen other ones that say 200, but I could not find anything on who documented that or how they did it.
That might be an estimate based on, if we're finding ones that are 150, it's likely some that are living longer, not just dying. That might just be an estimate too. I just thought there would be some study that showed like there was one that was 200 years old or something like that. Right.
Maybe, you know, it might have been one that like the stone and ivory weapon fragments where they're like, it could be as much as 200 years. That would make sense.
Yeah.
But why these guys live so long is really interesting. There's some really cool studies on that. So they basically have found that, let me go to the thing. Basically, they have genes that are better genes that and have selected for the genes that allow better repair of damaged DNA.
Ooh.
Yeah, so we all have those, right? Proofreading is really important when you're doing replication and whatnot. But if you have more of those, then you basically can not have cancer happen as much, you know, and these other things of these cells can live longer because they have these better genes. So a 2015 study looked at it, and they found that genes were under positive selection, and there were bowhead specific mutations in genes linked to cancer and aging. So they have like, yeah, they have specific mutations against that, which is
That's wild.
so cool. Like, can we all have that, please?
Well, and it's just so like, why them? Like, why that versus any other cetacean species?
Right. Why did they get the lucky end of the stick?
Oh, interesting.
They also found gain and loss of genes involving that were associated for genes associated with DNA repair, cell cycle regulation, cancer, and aging. So again, they're selectively the ones who are reproducing are the ones that have those better genes. And so there was possible adaptive genetic changes that confer cancer resistance. So again, these changes can help basically not get cancer. And then they also found these other changes in genes related to thermoregulation, sensory perception, dietary adaptations, immune response. So all of those things, if you can make those better, you're going to be able to live longer.
Wow.
Yeah. So their genome is awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was pretty amazed by that. And so cool that we can do that work now, you know?
Yeah.
Let me stay on the genes. So this one is so cool. Did you know that bowhead whales can smell?
I think I might have read something about this, so continue.
I did not. I was like, because, you know, odontocetes, toothed whales, dolphins, and porpoises, they don't have olfaction, right? There's no need to smell in the ocean. That's weird. But they looked at, this is a 2010 study that showed that they have the cribriform plate. So that's these kind of structures in your nose that we have, and small but histologically complex olfactory bulb in the brain. So it may be small, but it's mighty. It's more complex than you would think, it being that size. And it makes up 0.13% of brain weight. Now, that may not seem very big. However, remember that whales, dolphins, and porpoises in odontocetes, the toothed ones, don't have it at all. There's no olfactory bulb because they don't need it. So they also looked at genes, and 51% of olfactory receptor genes were intact. Whereas in odontocetes, less than 25% are left intact.
So is this something to do with living in ice, like living in a sea ice environment?
Possibly. I mean, they said they think they may be used to find aggregations of krill. So maybe it's an adaptation to being able to find these dense, groupings of these animals. Whereas other ones, if you're going after single individuals, it's not. I guess smelling isn't be as important. I don't know.
How fascinating.
Yeah, but yeah, whales can smell.
Do we know how ancient this species is compared to some other species?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, if they are farther back in the grand scheme of things, that they still have the olfaction from when they were on land.
Right. Because they're kind of in this odd little bubble up there, like they maybe haven't lost it when some other species have potentially.
That's true. Yeah, that could be. Absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, they all went in with the same kind of thing, and some of them lost it, some of them kept it. So perhaps their bubble up, you're like, right, that bubble up there made it so that was actually a useful thing rather than where it's not useful everywhere else in the world.
How interesting.
Yeah. That was so cool. Who knew? Let's see. I'm going to stay with the like molecular stuff here. In 2014, they were looking at hormones and stress and reproduction. And usually that's from tissue samples, so they can get cortisol levels or progesterone to look at reproduction, and cortisol is stress. But they use baleen as a tissue type for retrospective assessment. So they pulverized the baleen into powder, and then they found that it contained immunoreactive cortisol and progesterone that were detectable with commercially available enzyme immunoassay kits. So things that were already around, they could use just to look at it. And so they looked at some of these animals, and the base of the baleen, which is the most recent growth. And then they looked at older baleen at 10 to 20 or 30 centimeters from the base. So you could look at a timestamp, basically. And they found that females had higher concentration than males for both progesterone and cortisol. Cortisol was lower in older baleen with no sex or age correlations. So and this has been shown in other stress studies that basically, 30, 40, 100 years ago, their stress levels were much lower than they are now with everything that they have to deal with. Progesterone was higher in females than males for all the baleen, and higher in pregnant than non-pregnant females. So again, just a way that they can maybe look and see if there's pregnancies or not in different animals. And so they were saying that with further development of this tool, they could use baleen as a way to looking at these stress levels over time and over, longer periods of time than just a few years.
Wow.
Which is pretty cool. I'm going to do one for photo ID. They were using, we were talking about photo ID before, looking at the different white marks and scars and things. They can use unmanned aerial systems. So they did a pilot study in 2015 that using those, they were able to get good enough photographs to be able to do photo ID, and saw that there was basically none of the animals reacted in their approach. So they seemed to like, whatever, I don't care if you're taking a picture of me with that weird flying thing.
Right. So basically that's drones. For those of you who are not familiar with the term of unmanned aerial vehicles, that is a drone of some kind.
Some kind, yeah. It was a different looking, it was more like an airplane drone than the typical drones you think about, but there's lots of different types for sure. And then the last thing is that bowhead whales, like humpback whales, sing. And I don't think I knew that. Or maybe I did, but didn't really think about it. And so bowhead and humpback sing songs that change annually. And this is kind of unique in the baleen whale world, the whale, dolphin, porpoise world in general. The Spitsbergen whale population is the one that they looked at for this one. They had 184 different song types over a 3-year period from the Fram Strait in the Northeast Atlantic. 184.
Cool.
That's crazy. But what's interesting in different than the humpback whales, which usually have a song for at least the whole season, if not sometimes more than one season with just slight variations. These songs were over a shorter period, at most some months. So they're like, let's keep this going. Let's keep this changing. Let's this is something new. So they had very large variation, and it's unknown exactly why that occurs, but they postulated, they guessed that maybe it's from population expansion or immigration of animals when the sea ice is gone. So there's just more animals moving in and out of areas, and new guys are like, hey, this cool song's so cool. And everybody's like, woo, let's do that one. But they still have within season and annual shifting song types. So that doesn't really make sense with that. Yeah.
Right.
So the variation could be from weak selection pressure for interspecific identification. So up there, maybe they don't need to have a specific call because there's nobody else up there, because who else is crazy enough to live in the Arctic year round that sing songs? So they don't have to differentiate themselves from other species, or for maintenance of song characteristics. So there's weak selection for maintaining the song. Again, they don't really care. They like variation. Or strong pressure for novelty. So they like things that are different. So whoever's whatever the reason is for the song, whoever's selecting for the ones that are changing is saying that I like that better than the other ones. It's basically what they're saying. So I just thought it was cool, and I should look it up. I'm sure there's somewhere where you can listen to bowhead whale song, but I would be interested to listen to it compared to a humpback whale song.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah. So that's what I have for the cool research that has been going on in this. And cool, let me get it, see what I did there. The only other thing I had for a fun fact was that since these guys are coastal, which is unusual for baleen whales in a lot of ways, one of the longest standing population research projects counts whales passing from an observation perch on a pressure ridge from the edge of the shorefast ice in northern Alaska. So kind of cool that you can actually do like long-term monitoring population studies from land for these guys.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Most of the time you have to go up in a boat.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So I don't know, did you I think we probably went over all the fun facts that we had within there.
I think we just kind of threw them in throughout the episode today. So yeah, no, I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah. So these guys are super cool and super big, and really I mean, we'll have if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, I'll have a picture of the bowhead whale up there. But if you're listening to this on the podcast, be sure to go look them up. They're super cute. They're big giant heads, and the way that their mouths are curved, it's very distinct.
Yeah.
So they look pretty cool. So that was the bowhead whale. Thank you so much for picking it, because I think Kat and I were both very excited to do this one. I mean, we love all of them, but this one was very, very, very fun. So with that, next week will probably be a journal review, and be sure to check out our website and for our merch. We got our new merch with new designs, and so please go check that out. All the money goes back to our research and education initiatives, and if there's a design or a particular type of shirt that you want, please let us know, because we can add that to the store in the way that we have it set up. So let us know what you want, and we can see if we can give it to you. And so make sure to keep track with us on our Facebook and Instagram. Check out our website. And the end of year giving is coming up, so we'll have more about that as the season continues. But we really do rely on your assistance and help with funding for our small nonprofit to keep our research going and education stuff like this. So if you can, please feel free to donate on our website or anywhere you can do that. You can send us a check too. So with that, we will go ahead and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.